You are lying in bed. The room is dark, illuminated only by the cool artificial glow of your phone screen. It is past midnight. You are endlessly scrolling through a feed of perfectly curated videos. Suddenly, you see it, an aesthetic sunset lamp, a highly specific kitchen gadget, or a beautiful leather-bound journal. You don't need it. You didn't even know it existed 3 seconds ago, but within a minute, your thumb double taps to confirm the payment. A few days later, a cardboard box arrives on your porch. You open it, look at the item, and a familiar, quiet emptiness settles into your chest. You place it on a shelf where it will gather dust, wondering why you couldn't just keep your money in your bank account. Personality changes rarely happen overnight in dramatic cinematic moments. They happen so gradually that people almost never notice them taking place. They begin as ordinary behaviors, which turn into daily repetitions, which create subtle psychological effects, which slowly calcify into the traits we eventually call our personality. The question we have to ask is not simply why you feel the need to buy things you don't need, but rather, what if some parts of your personality are not simply who you are, but what you have practiced for a very long time? Think of the mind like a path through a forest. Walking through the forest once doesn't create much of a path, but walk in the same direction every day, and the grass slowly bends. The soil compacts. Eventually, the path becomes easier to follow than the untouched woods around it. The brain can work in a similar way. What we repeatedly practice can become easier to repeat. Repeated behaviors and thought patterns can deeply influence our attention, our emotional responses, our expectations, our habits, our self-perception, our coping patterns, and our automatic reactions. This does not mean that your personality is completely determined by your habits, or that your financial struggles are entirely your fault. Personality is incredibly complex. Consumer psychology is a billion-dollar industry designed to hack your attention. The goal here is not to suggest a deterministic transformation, but to explain how gradual influence works. Because once you understand how your brain learns to click buy, you can begin to teach it something else. You are sitting on your couch, feeling entirely disorganized. You see an advertisement for a premium, beautifully designed daily planner. It costs $50. You tell yourself that if you buy this planner, you will finally get your life together. You will wake up early, track your habits, and become highly productive. You buy it, but when it arrives, you write in it for exactly 2 days before abandoning it on your desk. And strangely, the hardest part isn't wasting $50. It is the immediate, visceral disappointment that purchasing an object did not magically change who you are. Maybe you call yourself impulsive. Maybe you think you simply lack the discipline to follow through. Maybe you've started believing that being hopelessly unorganized is just your personality. But this is not because you are naturally incapable of change. This is where the psychology of identity-based consumption and the idealized self becomes interesting. When you feel inadequate, your ego searches for an immediate solution. Buying an aesthetic planner creates an immediate, albeit false, sense of transformation. You are not buying paper. You are buying the feeling of being a productive person. And that transaction can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate purchasing with personal growth. The problem is that what gives you relief from your inadequacy today can make actual, unglamorous effort feel impossible tomorrow. You might see this bleed into your daily life. You buy expensive running shoes but never go for a run, or you purchase a towering stack of classic novels but never read them. It is like buying a ticket to a marathon and believing that holding the ticket means you have already crossed the finish line. At first, you think you are just being aspirational, but after months of accumulating props, you realize you are just building a movie set for a film you never shoot. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change what we own. They change our fundamental willingness to do the actual work. If you repeatedly purchase items to bridge the gap between who you are and who you want to be, you may gradually become more comfortable with consumerism than actual discipline. If you repeatedly mistake buying gear for taking action, starting the actual task may begin to feel less like a natural step and more like an overwhelming mountain. If you repeatedly practice outsourcing your identity to brands, finding your true self may begin to feel terrifying. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have given you a brief moment of hope in a dark time. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you don't actually lack discipline. Maybe you've simply trained yourself to use purchasing as a respectable excuse to avoid the messy vulnerability of trying and failing. What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practice doing the work with the cheap, ugly tools you already have for the next year, what might become easier? You have had a brutal, exhausting day at work. Your boss criticized you, your commute was terrible, and you feel completely drained. You lie in bed, open a shopping app, and order a 15 gadget you absolutely do not need. The moment the payment goes through, you feel a tiny, fleeting hit of satisfaction. But the next morning, you feel a pang of regret. And strangely, the hardest part isn't the wasted money. It's the sinking realization that you cannot sit alone with your own sadness for even 10 minutes without trying to buy your way out of it. Maybe you call it retail therapy. Maybe you think you're simply treating yourself because you deserve it. Maybe you've started believing that being a shopaholic is just a quirky part of your personality. But this is not because you are exceptionally materialistic. This is where the psychology of emotional regulation and the locus of control becomes relevant. When you have a terrible day, the world feels chaotic and unpredictable, you feel powerless. Pressing a Buy Now button is a guaranteed, predictable action with a guaranteed result. It creates an immediate, artificial sense of control over your environment, and that false control can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate spending money with emotional stabilization. The problem is that what gives you relief from stress today can destroy your ability to cope with reality tomorrow. You might find yourself ordering takeout every time you feel lonely, or buying new clothes every time you have an argument with your partner. It is like pressing the button at a pedestrian crosswalk over and over again, even though you know it isn't connected to the traffic lights. It gives your anxious hands something to do. At first, it feels like self-care, but eventually, you forget how to look both ways and cross the street on your own. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change how we spend money. They change what we naturally consider ourselves capable of enduring. If you repeatedly use transactions to soothe your nervous system, you may gradually become more comfortable with instant gratification than emotional resilience. If you repeatedly buy things to feel powerful, sitting quietly with a difficult emotion may begin to feel less like a normal human experience and more like an unbearable threat. If you repeatedly practice fleeing from sadness, the sadness itself may begin to feel like a monster. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have saved you from completely breaking down during a stressful season. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you are not naturally impulsive. Maybe you've simply practiced using your credit card as a shield against your own feelings. What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced sitting with a negative emotion for just 20 minutes without opening an app for the next year, what might become easier? Notice what is happening here. None of these behaviors look powerful. They look like passing thoughts. That's precisely why they are powerful. The things that shape us are not always dramatic. Sometimes they are the things we repeat so often that we stop noticing them entirely. By this point, you might be noticing something uncomfortable. Most of these behaviors, the avoiding, the soothing, the fantasizing, don't feel like decisions anymore. They feel like you. That's the strange thing about repetition. At first, you choose the behavior. Eventually, the behavior can begin choosing for you, but a habit can influence your personality without defining your identity. Recognizing a pattern is not a reason to shame yourself. It is a reason to become more conscious of it. You are watching a video about a new skincare product. A massive red timer on the screen warns you that the flash sale ends in exactly 3 minutes, and there are only 4 items left in stock. Your heart rate spikes. You don't know the brand, you haven't read the ingredients, but you panic. You scramble to enter your shipping details and secure the purchase. And strangely, the hardest part isn't the buyer's remorse. It's how easily your nervous system was hijacked by a completely artificial emergency. Maybe you call yourself a bargain hunter. Maybe you think you're simply being savvy and saving money in the long run. Maybe you've started believing that being deeply afraid of missing out is just your personality. But this is not because you are incredibly frugal. This is where the psychology of artificial scarcity and loss aversion comes into play. Human beings are biologically wired to fear losing something more than they value gaining something. When a website tells you time is running out, your brain does not register it as a marketing tactic. It registers it as a threat to your survival resources. Buying the item creates immediate relief from that evolutionary panic. And that relief can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate frantic compliance with safety from deprivation. The problem is that what saves you from missing out today can guarantee chronic, low-grade anxiety tomorrow. You might notice yourself constantly hoarding digital courses you will never watch, or buying clothes on clearance just because they were cheap. It is like stockpiling hundreds of gallons of water in the middle of a thunderstorm simply because a stranger on the street shouted that a drought might be coming. At first, it feels like preparation. But eventually, your house is so full of buckets that you have no room to live. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change what we accumulate. They change the psychological baseline from which we operate. If you repeatedly surrender to artificial urgency, you may gradually become more comfortable with chronic vigilance than calm abundance. If you repeatedly let countdown timers dictate your choices, trusting your own judgment may begin to feel less natural than following the panic of the crowd. If you repeatedly practice operating from a mindset of extreme scarcity, the world itself may begin to feel like a terrifying, barren wasteland. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have helped your ancestors survive brutal winters. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you are not naturally indecisive or greedy. Maybe you've practiced surrendering your autonomy to flashing red lights. What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced letting a sale expire on purpose for the next year, what might become easier? You buy a beautiful, expensive new desk for your home office. You set it up, step back, and admire it. But suddenly your old office chair looks incredibly ugly next to it, so you buy a new chair. Then the desk lamp looks outdated, so you replace it. Within a week, you have completely redesigned the entire room. And strangely, the hardest part isn't the depleted bank account. It's the terrifying suspicion that you will never actually reach a point of satisfaction. Maybe you call yourself aesthetically driven. Maybe you think you're simply upgrading your life and maintaining high standards. Maybe you've started believing that chronic dissatisfaction is just your personality. But this is not because you have exceptional taste. This is where the psychology of the Diderot effect and the spiral of consumption becomes profound. The Diderot effect states that obtaining a new possession often creates a spiral of consumption which leads you to acquire more new things. Your belongings form an interconnected web of identity. Introducing a new, elevated item shatters that cohesion. Buying more items creates an immediate restoration of harmony, and that harmony can teach the brain something. The brain begins to associate uniformity with peace. The problem is that what restores your aesthetic balance today can completely divorce you from the ability to appreciate what you already have tomorrow. You might buy a new dress and suddenly feel compelled to buy matching shoes, a matching bag, and new jewelry. It is like fixing a slightly crooked picture frame on the wall, only to convince yourself that the entire foundation of the house needs to be rebuilt. At first, you think you are just being detail-oriented, but eventually you are tearing down perfectly good walls. Some habits work the same way. They don't just change our interior design, they change how we define our own completion. If you repeatedly fixate on upgrading to match a new baseline, you may gradually become more comfortable with endless chasing than genuine gratitude. If you repeatedly let one new item dictate your worth, finding peace in the present moment may begin to feel less like a joy and more like a failure of ambition. If you repeatedly practice looking for what doesn't match, nothing will ever feel like enough. The habit isn't necessarily bad. It may have helped you elevate your standards in a positive way. The problem begins when the strategy that once protected you becomes the only strategy you know. What does this habit give you today? And what might it cost you tomorrow? Maybe you are not naturally ungrateful. Maybe you've aggressively practiced using consumption as a respectable excuse to avoid the vulnerability of simply being content. What if some of the things you call your personality are simply patterns that have been repeated long enough to feel permanent? What have you been practicing without realizing it? And if you practiced letting things be slightly mismatched for the next year, what might become easier? But there is a deeper idea underneath all of this. We have been culturally conditioned to view consumption as a virtue. We assume that upgrading our lives, treating ourselves, and keeping up with the trends are signs of success. But understanding this difference between who you are and what you repeatedly practice is the key to untangling your identity from your shopping cart. Changing a pattern does not mean you have to completely destroy yourself to become a miserable minimalist. It simply means giving yourself more choices. A steering wheel doesn't decide where a car must go. It simply gives the driver the ability to change direction when the road curves. Awareness works in a similar way. Realizing that you have been practicing these habits does not instantly teleport you to a place of perfect financial peace, but it gives you agency. It gives you the steering wheel back. Why does any of this matter? Because the small choices you make every single day are quietly building the architecture of your future mind. One day doesn't define you. One impulsive purchase doesn't define you. One moment of giving into a sale doesn't define you. One bad habit doesn't define you. But what you repeatedly return to deserves your attention. The quiet ways you try to buy discipline, the subtle ways you use credit cards to soothe sadness, the invisible ways you let marketing dictate your worth, these are not insignificant simply because they are small. They are repeated. And repetition accumulates into a life. What are you practicing becoming? Are you practicing endless consumption, or are you practicing enoughness? You are allowed to rewrite the script. You are allowed to leave the item in the cart. You are allowed to be delightfully imperfect and perfectly content with what you have, because perhaps the person you become isn't decided in one dramatic, flawless moment of finally owning all the right things. Perhaps they are being shaped quietly, gently, and inevitably in the things you do again tomorrow.